The chemistry lab erupted in chaos as 17-year-old Emma Rodriguez stood motionless, her face blazing with humiliation while cruel laughter echoed off the tile walls. Madison Brooks dangled the severed bra strap like a victory flag, her scissors glinting under the fluorescent lights. What Madison didn't know was that the quiet girl she'd just humiliated had been mastering the ancient art of judo for 5 years, and in 30 seconds, those same bullies would be sprawled across the floor, sobbing and begging for mercy. This is the story of how one moment of cruelty unleashed a whirlwind of justice that would transform an entire school district and prove that sometimes the most devastating counterattack comes from the most unexpected source. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Rodriguez had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight. At 17, she moved through the corridors of Riverside High School like a shadow, her long black hair creating a curtain between herself and the world. In the small town of Millbrook, Oregon, where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, Emma had managed to remain virtually invisible for 3 years. She preferred it that way. While other students fought for attention and social media followers, Emma found peace in her sketchbook, drawing intricate manga characters during lunch breaks and dreaming of the art scholarship that might finally give her family a break from their constant financial struggles. Her parents, Maria and Carlos Rodriguez, had immigrated from Mexico 15 years ago and built their lives around a small family restaurant called Casa Rodriguez downtown. Every evening after school, Emma would tie on an apron and help serve tables, her tips carefully saved in a mason jar hidden under her bed. The money was meant for art supplies and maybe, if she was lucky, college application fees. Art was her escape, her passion, and her secret hope for a future beyond the confines of Millbrook's limited opportunities. But Emma carried another secret, one that even her closest friends didn't know about. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, while most students were at home scrolling through their phones or hanging out at the local mall, Emma could be found at the Riverside Community Dojo. For 5 years, since she was 12 years old, she had been studying judo under the patient guidance of Mrs. Chun, a 70-year-old instructor who had competed in the Olympics decades ago. What started as a way to build confidence had evolved into something much deeper. Emma had earned her brown belt the previous summer, just 1 rank below the coveted black belt, but she kept this achievement hidden from her classmates. In her mind, drawing attention to her martial arts skills would only invite trouble, and trouble was something she had successfully avoided throughout high school. Riverside High School sprawled across 12 acres on the outskirts of Millbrook, a typical public school serving students from both the town proper and the surrounding rural communities. The building itself was a maze of beige hallways, outdated lockers, and classrooms that smelled perpetually of disinfectant and teenage anxiety. Like most high schools, it had its unspoken social hierarchy, invisible battle lines drawn between the popular kids, the athletes, the theater nerds, and everyone else who fell somewhere in between. Emma belonged to that vast middle ground of students who neither excelled socially nor caused problems, the ones teachers barely remembered and administrators never noticed. The chemistry wing was located on the 2nd floor of the east building, where large windows overlooked the student parking lot and the football field beyond. It was here, in Mr. Thompson's 3rd period advanced chemistry class, that Emma had spent the first semester quietly mastering equations and conducting experiments while carefully avoiding any interactions that might draw unwanted attention. She always chose a lab station near the back corner, close enough to hear instructions, but far enough from the center of social activity to remain unnoticed. That carefully constructed invisibility would shatter on a gray Tuesday morning in February. Madison Brooks ruled Riverside High with the casual cruelty that came naturally to 17-year-olds born into privilege. The daughter of City Councilman Robert Brooks, Madison had never known a world where her desires weren't immediately fulfilled or her actions didn't come with built-in protection. Tall and blonde with the kind of effortless beauty that made other girls simultaneously envious and secure, Madison moved through the hallways like royalty, surrounded by her carefully chosen court of loyal followers. Chloe Peterson and Ashley Kim had earned their positions in Madison's inner circle through different means. Chloe, a redhead with sharp green eyes and a sharper tongue, served as Madison's lieutenant, always ready with a cutting remark or cruel observation. She came from old Millbrook money, her family owning the largest lumber mill in the county, which gave her a sense of entitlement that rivaled Madison's own. Ashley, meanwhile, was the strategist of the group, quiet and calculating, with an uncanny ability to identify others' weaknesses and exploit them for maximum damage. Her parents were both successful lawyers who had taught her that winning was everything and that rules were merely suggestions for people without enough influence to break them. Together, the three girls formed a triangle of torment that had made life miserable for countless students over the years. They were smart enough to avoid the kind of obvious bullying that would get them suspended, instead specializing in psychological warfare, social manipulation, and carefully orchestrated humiliation campaigns that left their victims questioning their own sanity. Teachers loved them because they maintained perfect grades and participated enthusiastically in class discussions. Administrators praised them as model students who represented the best of Riverside High. Parents at school board meetings pointed to them as examples of what proper upbringing and family values could produce. But behind their polished facades lurked a darkness that fed on others' pain. Emma first appeared on Madison's radar during the second week of February, though the incident that would change everything had its roots in something far more mundane than anyone could have imagined. It started in the cafeteria during lunch, when Emma was carrying a tray loaded with her usual meal of a sandwich, apple, and chocolate milk toward her customary table in the far corner. She had her sketchbook tucked under one arm and was mentally reviewing the chemistry formulas she needed to memorize for that afternoon's test when disaster struck. Madison had been holding court at the center table, regaling her followers with a story about her weekend shopping trip to Portland, when she stood up suddenly to demonstrate something, stepping directly backward into Emma's path. The collision was inevitable and entirely accidental. Emma's tray tilted, sending chocolate milk cascading across Madison's pristine white sweater, the brown liquid spreading across the expensive fabric like a stain of shame. The cafeteria fell silent as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire room. Emma stood frozen, her face burning with mortification as she watched the milk drip from Madison's sweater onto her designer jeans. She immediately began apologizing, grabbing napkins from nearby tables and offering to pay for dry cleaning, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to make things right. Madison's reaction was ice-cold fury disguised as gracious forgiveness. She smiled sweetly as she accepted Emma's apologies, even going so far as to pat Emma's shoulder and assure her that accidents happen. But Emma caught the flash of something dangerous in Madison's eyes, a promise of retribution that made her stomach clench with dread. Chloe and Ashley flanked their leader like bodyguards, their expressions carefully neutral but their eyes already calculating revenge. That night, as Emma helped her parents close the restaurant, she tried to push the incident from her mind. It had been an accident, nothing more. Madison had seemed understanding, even kind. Perhaps she was overthinking things, letting her natural anxiety transform a simple mishap into something more sinister than it actually was. She threw herself into her homework and spent an extra hour reviewing chemistry formulas, determined to ace the next day's test and put the cafeteria incident behind her. She had no idea that Madison, Chloe, and Ashley had spent the evening planning her destruction with the methodical precision of military strategists preparing for war. The chemistry lab buzzed with nervous energy as students filed in for third period on Wednesday morning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mr. Thompson, a balding man in his 50s who had long ago lost any passion he might have once felt for teaching, sat at his desk grading papers while the students set up their lab stations. Today's experiment involved testing the pH levels of various household substances, a relatively simple procedure that required students to work in pairs with litmus paper and careful observation. Emma arrived early, as was her habit, and claimed her usual station in the back corner. She laid out her lab notebook, organized her pencils, and began reading through the procedure while waiting for class to officially begin. The familiar routine of preparation helped calm her nerves, which had been on edge since the cafeteria incident the day before. She had managed to avoid Madison and her friends in the hallways, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Madison entered the classroom with her usual fanfare, laughing loudly at something Chloe had whispered in her ear while Ashley trailed behind them with her arms full of expensive lab equipment their parents had purchased to supplement the school's aging supplies. They chose a station in the center of the room, close enough to command attention but positioned so they could observe the entire class without seeming obvious about it. Mr. Thompson called the class to order with his usual lack of enthusiasm, briefly explaining the day's experiment before turning his attention back to his paperwork. He had learned years ago that the best way to survive teaching chemistry to teenagers was to provide minimal supervision and hope nothing exploded. The students began their work, the room filling with the sounds of clinking glass, rustling papers, and whispered conversations. Emma partnered with Jake Martinez, a quiet boy who shared her preference for avoiding attention. They worked methodically through their tests, recording pH levels and discussing their observations in hushed tones. Emma found herself relaxing as she lost herself in the familiar rhythm of scientific inquiry. For a few precious moments, she forgot about Madison's calculating stare and Chloe's whispered threats. That peace was about to be shattered in the most humiliating way possible. Madison had been watching Emma throughout the class period, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She had positioned herself so she could observe Emma's movements, while appearing to focus on her own experiment. Chloe and Ashley flanked her like sentinels, their eyes occasionally flicking toward Emma before returning to their leader for silent confirmation of the plan they had rehearsed the night before. The opportunity came when Mr. Thompson stepped out of the classroom to retrieve something from the supply closet down the hall. He would be gone for at least 5 minutes, plenty of time for what Madison had in mind. She caught Chloe's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly, then began moving toward Emma's station with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for her actions. Emma was bent over her lab notebook, carefully recording the pH reading of lemon juice, when she felt someone approach from behind. She glanced up to see Madison standing beside her station, holding a pair of lab scissors and wearing an expression of false concern. "Emma, honey," Madison said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I think there's something wrong with your lab coat. It looks like the ties are tangled or something." Emma looked down at her lab coat, confused. The ties seemed fine to her, but before she could respond, Madison had moved behind her, ostensibly to help fix whatever problem she claimed to see. Jake Martinez looked up from his own work, sensing something was wrong, but unable to identify exactly what. What happened next occurred so quickly that several students later claimed they hadn't seen it clearly. Madison's scissors flashed in the fluorescent light as she reached beneath Emma's lab coat and made 2 quick, precise cuts. The straps of Emma's bra separated with barely audible snaps, the elastic recoiling as the tension was released. Emma felt the change immediately, her undergarment loosening and shifting beneath her clothes. Her face went white as she realized what had happened, her hands instinctively moving to her chest as Madison stepped back with a triumphant smile. "Oops," Madison said loudly, holding up the scissors for everyone to see. "I guess these were sharper than I thought. Sorry about that, Emma." The classroom erupted in laughter as students turned to see what was happening. Chloe began a slow clap that others joined, while Ashley pulled out her phone to record Emma's humiliation. Emma stood paralyzed by shock and embarrassment, her arms wrapped around herself as she tried to process what had just happened. "What's wrong, Emma?" Madison taunted, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "You look a little unsupported." More laughter rippled through the classroom as students began to understand what they were witnessing. Emma's face burned with shame as she felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. This was her worst nightmare come to life, the kind of public humiliation that would follow her through the rest of high school and beyond. But as she stood there, arms crossed protectively over her chest while her classmates laughed and pointed, something unexpected began to stir within Emma Rodriguez. It started as a flutter in her chest, then grew into a warm, spreading sensation that seemed to originate from somewhere deep in her core. Her breathing changed, becoming deeper and more controlled, the way Mrs. Chun had taught her during meditation exercises at the dojo. The laughter around her began to fade into background noise as Emma's training took over. She could hear Mrs. Chun's voice in her mind, calm and steady. "Judo is not about anger, Emma. It is about balance, timing, and using your opponent's energy against them. The moment your enemy attacks is the moment they become most vulnerable." Emma slowly lowered her arms and turned to face Madison directly. Her tears had stopped falling, replaced by a look of focused determination that made several nearby students take an involuntary step backward. Madison, still basking in her triumph, didn't notice the change in Emma's demeanor until it was too late. "That was a mistake," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying a steel edge that no one at Riverside High had ever heard before. Madison laughed, interpreting Emma's words as the empty threat of a humiliated victim. "Oh, really? And what are you going to do about it, little mouse? Run crying to your mommy?" The classroom had grown quiet again, students sensing that something significant was about to happen, but unable to predict exactly what. Jake Martinez found himself backing away from the confrontation, his instincts warning him to get clear of whatever was coming. Emma took a deep breath and settled into a stance that looked casual to untrained eyes but would have been immediately recognized by any martial artist as preparation for combat. Her weight shifted slightly onto the balls of her feet, her center of gravity lowering almost imperceptibly as her muscles prepared for explosive movement. "I'm going to teach you about consequences," Emma said, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. Madison's smirk faltered slightly as something in Emma's posture registered as genuinely threatening. She had expected tears, apologies, maybe angry words at most. She had not expected this calm, focused intensity that seemed to radiate from the girl she had just humiliated. "You're crazy if you think you can," Madison began, but she never finished the sentence. Emma moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours perfecting her technique. Her right hand shot out to grip the front of Madison's lab coat while her left hand secured a hold on Madison's sleeve. In the same motion, she stepped forward and to the side, her right leg sweeping behind Madison's legs as she executed a perfect osotogari, one of judo's most fundamental throwing techniques. Madison's world turned upside down as she found herself airborne, her feet leaving the ground as Emma used her own forward momentum against her. The throw was textbook perfect, controlled and devastating in equal measure. Madison landed hard on her back on the linoleum floor, the impact driving the air from her lungs in a sharp gasp that echoed through the suddenly silent classroom. But Emma wasn't finished. As Madison struggled to breathe and understand what had just happened to her, Emma smoothly transitioned into a pin, dropping to one knee beside Madison's prone form and securing a hold that would have been approved by any judo referee. Madison found herself completely immobilized, Emma's superior technique and positioning making any escape impossible. "Chloe, Ashley," Emma said without looking up from Madison, her voice still maintaining that unnaturally calm tone. "I suggest you step back unless you want to join your friend down here." Chloe and Ashley, who had been moving forward to help Madison, froze in their tracks. They had never seen anything like what had just happened, and the casual competence with which Emma had dismantled their leader left them temporarily speechless. Madison, meanwhile, was discovering that being thrown to the ground was only the beginning of her problems. Emma's pin was not just effective. It was actively uncomfortable, applying pressure to sensitive points that made struggling both futile and painful. Moreover, Emma seemed to know exactly how much pressure to apply to be maximally unpleasant without causing serious injury. "Let me go," Madison gasped, her voice lacking its usual authority. "You can't do this. I'll have you expelled." Emma leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only Madison could hear. "You humiliated me in front of our entire class. You violated my body and my dignity. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" The pressure of Emma's pin increased slightly, making Madison wince. "Here's what's going to happen," Emma continued in that same quiet, controlled tone. "You're going to apologize to me in front of everyone here. You're going to admit what you did was wrong. And you're going to promise never to target me or anyone else in this school again. Never." Madison spat, though her defiance was somewhat undermined by her prone position and obvious discomfort. Emma's response was to shift her grip slightly, applying pressure to a different set of nerve points that made Madison yelp involuntarily. Several students who had been recording the incident on their phones stopped, suddenly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. "I have all day," Emma said matter-of-factly. "And I know at least 20 different ways to make you extremely uncomfortable without actually injuring you." Mrs. Chun was very thorough in her teaching. It was at that moment that Mr. Thompson chose to return to the classroom, stopping dead. In the doorway as he took in the scene before him, Madison Brooks, one of the school's most prominent students, was pinned to the floor by Emma Rodriguez, the quiet girl who never caused trouble. Half the class was filming with their phones while the other half stood in shocked silence. "What in the world is going on here?" Mr. Thompson demanded, though his tone suggested he really didn't want to know the answer. Emma looked up at him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. "Madison cut my bra straps with scissors as a prank, Mr. Thompson. I was explaining to her why that was inappropriate." Mr. Thompson's face went pale as he realized the implications of what Emma was telling him. This wasn't just a student altercation. It was a potential assault case that could result in lawsuits, media attention, and the kind of administrative nightmare that ended teaching careers. "Everyone put your phones away immediately," he ordered, his voice shaking slightly. "Emma, please release Madison so we can discuss this properly." Emma considered this request for a moment, then looked down at Madison's flushed face. "Are you ready to apologize?" she asked quietly. Madison's pride warred with her discomfort for several seconds before pragmatism won out. Through gritted teeth, she managed to say, "I'm sorry I cut your bra straps. It was wrong." Emma nodded and smoothly released the pin, rising to her feet with the same fluid grace she had displayed throughout the encounter. Madison struggled to sit up, rubbing her shoulder where Emma's pressure point technique had been particularly effective. The classroom remained silent as Mr. Thompson struggled to figure out how to handle a situation that was completely outside his experience. He had dealt with fights before, but this had been something entirely different. Emma had displayed a level of skill and control that suggested serious martial arts training, while Madison had been utterly helpless despite her usual social dominance. "All of you, return to your experiments immediately," Mr. Thompson finally managed. "Emma, Madison, you'll both be coming with me to the principal's office." As the class reluctantly returned to their lab work, Emma calmly gathered her belongings. and prepared to face whatever consequences awaited her. She felt no regret for her actions, only a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in her life, she had refused to be a victim, and the feeling was intoxicating. Madison, meanwhile, struggled to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster, though the flush on her face and the slight tremor in her hands betrayed how shaken she was by the encounter. She had ruled Riverside High through intimidation and social manipulation for years, but she had just learned that some people couldn't be controlled through traditional means. As they walked toward the principal's office, Emma could hear the excited whispers following them down the hallway. By the end of the day, everyone in school would know what had happened in the chemistry lab. The quiet girl had fought back, and nothing would ever be the same. Principal Johnson's office felt smaller than usual as Emma and Madison sat on opposite sides of the room, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. The principal herself was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and wire-rimmed glasses that seemed to magnify her perpetually disapproving expression. She had built her career on maintaining order and avoiding controversy, two goals that now seemed impossibly out of reach given the situation unfolding in her office. Mr. Thompson had delivered his version of events in nervous, halting sentences, clearly uncomfortable with having to report what amounted to a physical altercation between two students he had always considered well-behaved. He kept glancing between Emma and Madison as if expecting one of them to suddenly reveal that the entire incident had been an elaborate prank designed to test his blood pressure. Principal Johnson listened to his account with growing alarm, her expression darkening with each detail. When he finished, she turned her attention to Madison, her voice carefully modulated to project authority, while avoiding any hint of accusation that might later be used against the school in legal proceedings. Madison's version of events bore only a passing resemblance to reality. According to her carefully crafted narrative, she had simply been trying to help Emma with what appeared to be a problem with her lab coat, when the scissors had accidentally slipped. The cuts to Emma's undergarment had been entirely unintentional, a tragic mishap that she deeply regretted. Emma's violent response, however, had been completely unprovoked and utterly disproportionate to what had been nothing more than an unfortunate accident. As Madison spun her tale of innocence and victimization, Emma found herself marveling at the girl's ability to rewrite history in real time. Madison's voice trembled with just the right amount of emotion, her eyes filling with tears at precisely the correct moments to maximize sympathy. It was a masterful performance, the kind of manipulation that had allowed her to escape consequences for years of psychological terrorism. When it came time for Emma to present her side of the story, she chose her words carefully. She described the deliberate nature of Madison's actions, the humiliation she had experienced, and her decision to defend herself when it became clear that no help was forthcoming from the adult supposedly supervising the classroom. She spoke calmly and factually, avoiding emotional appeals or dramatic flourishes, letting the truth of her experience speak for itself. Principal Johnson found herself in an impossible position. On one hand, she had Madison Brooks, daughter of a city councilman and one of the school's most prominent families, claiming to be the victim of an unprovoked assault. On the other hand, she had Emma Rodriguez, a student with no history of disciplinary problems, alleging that Madison had deliberately cut her undergarments in front of an entire classroom. The political implications of either decision were staggering. The principal's dilemma deepened when she considered the martial arts skills Emma had displayed. The controlled manner in which Emma had subdued Madison suggested serious training, which raised questions about whether Emma's response had been excessive, given her obvious advantage in combat skills. At the same time, the deliberate nature of Madison's actions, if proven true, would constitute a serious violation of the school's harassment and assault policies. After nearly an hour of questioning and cross-examination, Principal Johnson made The decision that would later be seen as the first in a series of administrative failures that would ultimately cost her career. She chose to suspend both students for 3 days, citing the need for a thorough investigation while emotions cooled down. It was a classic administrative compromise, designed to appear fair while actually satisfying no one. Emma accepted her suspension with quiet dignity, understanding that the principal was trying to navigate an impossible situation. Madison, however, was outraged by what she saw as an unjust punishment for being the victim of an assault. Her protests grew louder and more indignant until Principal Johnson was forced to call Madison's father to come collect his daughter. City Councilman Robert Brooks arrived at the school within 30 minutes, his expensive suit and commanding presence immediately shifting the power dynamics in the room. He listened to his daughter's tearful account of her victimization with growing anger, his face reddening as she described Emma's unprovoked attack and the school's incompetent response to the situation. The meeting that followed between Councilman Brooks and Principal Johnson took place behind closed doors, but the raised voices could be heard throughout the administrative wing. When it ended, Emma's suspension had been extended to a full week, while Madison's had been reduced to 3 days of in-school suspension that would not appear on her permanent record. Emma's parents arrived to collect their daughter in a state of complete bewilderment. Maria Rodriguez clutched her purse tightly as she listened to Principal Johnson's sanitized version of events, while Carlos Rodriguez stood silently beside his wife, his weathered hands clenched into fists as he struggled to process what had happened to his daughter. When they finally left the school with Emma in tow, the family drove home in heavy silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what this incident might mean for their future. The aftermath of the chemistry lab incident spread through Riverside High like wildfire. By the end of the school day, 3 different versions of events were circulating among the student body, each more embellished than the last. Some students described Emma as a secret ninja who had appeared from nowhere to destroy Madison with ancient martial arts techniques. Others painted Madison as an innocent victim of a psychotic assault by a disturbed classmate who had been hiding her violent tendencies behind a facade of artistic sensitivity. The truth, as often happens in the echo chamber of high school gossip, became increasingly irrelevant as the story took on a life of its own. Students who had not even been present during the incident found themselves offering eyewitness accounts to anyone willing to listen. The video recordings that several classmates had made disappeared mysteriously after Principal Johnson confiscated all phones and deleted any footage related to the incident. Chloe Peterson and Ashley Kim found themselves in the unusual position of being secondary characters in a drama that had always revolved around their leadership. Without Madison's commanding presence to guide them, they struggled to maintain their social dominance while dealing with the reality that their seemingly invincible leader had been humiliated by someone they had considered beneath notice. Chloe's response was to double down on Madison's version of events, spreading increasingly dramatic accounts of Emma's unprovoked assault and positioning herself as Madison's loyal defender against a dangerous criminal. She organized a social media campaign designed to portray Madison as a victim of bullying, carefully editing the narrative to remove any mention of the circumstances that had led to the confrontation. Ashley, meanwhile, took a more calculating approach. She recognized that the incident had shifted the social dynamics at Riverside High in ways that might not be reversible. Emma's display of martial arts skills had shattered the illusion of Madison's invincibility, and Ashley was smart enough to know that other students would take notice. She began quietly distancing herself from the most extreme aspects of Madison's behavior while positioning herself to maintain influence regardless of how the situation ultimately resolved. Jake Martinez, who had been Emma's lab partner during the incident, found himself thrust into an unwanted spotlight as other students saw his first-hand account of what had transpired. Initially, he tried to remain neutral, but the pressure from both sides eventually forced him to choose. His decision to support Emma's version of events would later prove crucial in establishing the truth of what had happened. The teachers at Riverside High reacted to the incident with a mixture of concern and self-preservation. Most had heard rumors about Madison's behavior over the years, but the girl's family connections and academic performance had made addressing those concerns professionally dangerous. Emma's violent response, however, had forced the issue into the open in a way that could no longer be ignored. Mr. Thompson found himself under particular scrutiny for his handling of the situation. Questions were raised about why he had left the classroom unsupervised and whether he should have noticed the escalating tension between the students. His explanation that he had only been gone for a few minutes and that both girls had always been model students satisfied no one, least of all the administrators who were looking for someone to blame for the crisis. The school's guidance counselors were tasked with conducting interviews with all students who had been present during the incident, ostensibly to provide support and counseling, but actually to gather information that might help the administration craft a defensible narrative. These interviews revealed a troubling pattern of behavior from Madison and her friends that had gone unreported for years, largely because students feared retaliation or believed that reporting would be futile. Several students spoke hesitantly about incidents they had witnessed or experienced personally, describing a campaign of psychological harassment that had been hidden behind a veneer of popularity and academic success. The counselors documented these accounts carefully, but their reports disappeared into administrative files where they would remain buried until much later. Events forced them back into the light. Emma spent her week of suspension at home, helping her parents at the restaurant and trying to process the dramatic changes in her life. The quiet invisibility she had cultivated for years had been shattered in a single moment of decisive action, and she was still coming to terms with the implications of that choice. Her sister Sophia drove down from college that weekend, her journalism major instincts immediately recognizing the larger story hidden within Emma's account of the incident. Sophia had always been the more outgoing of the two sisters, the one who thrived on attention and conflict in ways that Emma had always found exhausting. But as she listened to Emma describe the humiliation in the chemistry lab and the subsequent administrative response, Sophia's protective instincts overrode her natural inclination toward detached observation. The Rodriguez family spent hours discussing the situation around their kitchen table, weighing their options and considering the potential consequences of different courses of action. Carlos wanted to confront Councilman Brooks directly, his traditional masculine pride, demanding some form of direct retaliation for the humiliation his daughter had suffered. Maria favored a more cautious approach, fearing that challenging such a powerful family might result in even worse consequences for Emma and potentially threaten the family's livelihood. Sophia argued for documentation and publicity, insisting that the only way to prevent future incidents was to expose the systematic nature of Madison's behavior and the school's failure to address it. She offered to help Emma compile evidence and tell her story to local media outlets, confident that public pressure would force the administration to take meaningful action. Emma herself remained conflicted about how to proceed. Part of her wanted nothing more than to return to her previous invisibility, to pretend the incident had never happened and hope that everyone else would eventually forget about it. But a larger part of her recognized that something fundamental had changed, both within herself and in her relationship with the world around her. She had discovered that she possessed the power to defend herself and others, and with that discovery came a responsibility she was still learning to understand. Mrs. Chun, Emma's judo instructor, played a crucial role in helping her student process the emotional aftermath of the confrontation. When Emma returned to the dojo for her regular Tuesday session, Mrs. Chun could immediately see the internal struggle her student was experiencing. The elderly instructor had been teaching martial arts for over 40 years and had seen countless students face the moment when their training transitioned from theoretical knowledge to practical application. She understood that Emma was grappling not just with the immediate consequences of her actions, but with deeper questions about the appropriate use of force and the responsibilities that came with martial arts training. Mrs. Chun's approach to addressing these concerns reflected the philosophical depths of traditional judo instruction. Rather than focusing solely on the technical aspects of what Emma had done, she guided her student through a deeper exploration of the principles that should govern the use of martial arts skills in real-world situations. The concept of maximum efficiency with minimum effort that forms the foundation of judo training became the lens through which Emma examined her response to Madison's attack. Mrs. Chun helped her understand that true martial arts mastery involved not just the physical ability to subdue an opponent, but the wisdom to know when such action was necessary and the restraint to use only the minimum force required to resolve a conflict. Through their conversations, Emma began to see her confrontation with Madison not as a failure of self-control, but as an application of the principles she had been studying for years. She had been attacked, she had defended herself with appropriate force, and she had stopped when her attacker was no longer a threat. The guilt and uncertainty she had been feeling gradually gave way to a clearer understanding of her own actions and their moral justification. Mrs. Chun also helped Emma understand the broader implications of her decision to use her martial arts training in a school setting. The instructor explained that Emma's actions would inevitably become known within the local martial arts community, and that her behavior would reflect not just on herself, but on the dojo and the art of judo itself. This additional layer of responsibility initially overwhelmed Emma, but Mrs. Chun's patient guidance helped her see it as an opportunity rather than a burden. If her story became public, as it seemed increasingly likely to do, she would have a platform to educate others about the true nature of martial arts training and the values it sought to instill. Meanwhile, Madison's week of in-school suspension was proving to be more challenging than she had anticipated. Isolated from her usual support network and forced to spend her days in a sterile administrative office under constant supervision, she found herself confronting the reality of her situation without the usual distractions and ego-boosting activities that normally occupied her time. The physical soreness from Emma's judo throw had faded within a few days, but the psychological impact of being so completely overpowered by someone she had considered inferior was proving much more difficult to overcome. Madison had built her entire identity around her ability to dominate and control others, and Emma's demonstration of superior force had shattered that foundation in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her father's response to the incident had been characteristically aggressive, focusing on legal remedies and political pressure rather than addressing any underlying issues with Madison's behavior. Councilman Brooks had immediately contacted the family's attorney to explore options for civil litigation against both Emma and the school district, while simultaneously pressuring Principal Johnson and Superintendent Williams to take more severe disciplinary action against Emma. These efforts were meeting with mixed success. The attorney had expressed concerns about the strength of their case, particularly given the apparent premeditation involved in Madison's attack on Emma and the proportionate nature of Emma's response. The political pressure was proving more effective, with several school board members expressing support for a more aggressive approach to dealing with what they characterized as a dangerous escalation in student violence. However, the situation was complicated by the growing awareness among school officials that the incident had exposed systemic problems that went far beyond a simple fight between two students. The interviews conducted by guidance counselors had revealed a pattern of behavior that could potentially expose the district to significant liability if it became public knowledge. Chloe Peterson was discovering that leadership was more difficult than she had anticipated. With Madison temporarily absent and Ashley becoming increasingly unreliable as an ally, Chloe found herself trying to maintain their social dominance while dealing with growing skepticism from other students who had witnessed Emma's display of martial arts skills. Her attempts to rally support for Madison's version of events were meeting with limited success. Too many students had been present during the chemistry lab incident, and while the official video recordings had been confiscated, several students had managed to preserve their own footage by uploading it to private social media accounts before surrendering their phones. These unofficial recordings provided a much clearer picture of what had actually transpired, showing Madison's deliberate actions with the scissors and Emma's controlled response to the attack. While the quality was poor and the angles were limited, the footage was sufficient to contradict the narrative of unprovoked assault that Madison and her supporters were trying to establish. Chloe's increasing desperation led her to make tactical errors that would later prove costly. Her attempts to intimidate students who supported Emma's version of events became increasingly obvious and heavy-handed, drawing attention from teachers and administrators who had previously been willing to overlook her behavior. Ashley Kim's more calculated approach was proving equally problematic, though for different reasons. Her attempts to distance herself from the most controversial aspects of Madison's behavior were being interpreted by other students as betrayal, undermining the loyalty that had been crucial to their group's effectiveness. The social dynamics at Riverside High were shifting in ways that none of the main participants had anticipated. Emma's demonstration of martial arts skills had revealed that the apparent power structure was more fragile than anyone had realized, and students who had previously been intimidated by Madison's group were beginning to find their own voices. Jake Martinez emerged as an unexpected leader in this changing environment. His first-hand witness account of the chemistry lab incident carried significant weight with other students, and his decision to support Emma's version of events had encouraged others to come forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. A group of students who had been targets of Madison's group began meeting informally during lunch periods, initially just to share their experiences, but gradually developing into a more organized effort to document the systematic nature of the harassment they had endured. These students represented a cross-section of the school's population, united not by shared interests or social status, but by their common experience of victimization. The emergence of this informal support network represented a fundamental shift in the school's social ecosystem. For the first time in years, students who had been isolated and intimidated by Madison's group found themselves part of a larger community with the potential to affect real change. Sofia Rodriguez's investigation into the incident was revealing disturbing patterns that extended far beyond the immediate conflict between her sister and Madison Brooks. Her journalism training had taught her to look for systemic issues underlying individual incidents, and what she was discovering suggested that the problems at Riverside High were much more extensive than even Emma had realized. Through careful interviews with current and former students, Sofia was documenting a history of harassment and intimidation that stretched back several years. The pattern that emerged showed a systematic campaign of psychological warfare, directed primarily at students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnic minorities, and anyone else who didn't fit into the narrow definition of acceptability established by Madison's group. What made these findings particularly disturbing was the evidence that school administrators had been aware of many of these incidents but had consistently failed to take meaningful action. Sofia's investigation revealed a pattern of complaints that had been dismissed, investigations that had been conducted in ways that protected the perpetrators rather than the victims, and disciplinary actions that had been reduced or eliminated entirely when they involved students from influential families. The documentation Sofia was compiling painted a picture of institutional failure that went far beyond the specific incident involving Emma. It suggested that Riverside High had become a hostile environment for significant numbers of students, maintained through a combination of administrative negligence and deliberate protection of students whose families wielded political or economic influence. As Emma's week of suspension drew to a close, the various forces set in motion by the chemistry lab incident were beginning to converge in ways that would soon explode into public view. The informal network of student victims was growing bolder in their willingness to share their experiences, while Sophia's investigation was uncovering documentary evidence that would be difficult for school officials to dismiss or explain away. Madison's return to school was being anticipated with a mixture of excitement and apprehension by students across the social spectrum. Some expected her to reassert her dominance through even more aggressive tactics, while others hoped that her experience of being overpowered might have taught her some humility. Emma herself was preparing for her return with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. She had spent the week processing the dramatic changes in her life and had come to understand that there was no returning to her previous invisibility. Whether she liked it or not, she had become a symbol of resistance to the culture of intimidation that had dominated Riverside High for years. The stage was set for a confrontation that would extend far beyond the personal conflict between two students and ultimately transform not just Riverside High School, but the entire Millbrook community's understanding of bullying, institutional responsibility, and the power of individual courage to catalyze systemic change. Emma's return to Riverside High on Monday morning felt like walking onto a battlefield where the opposing armies had spent the weekend choosing sides. The hallways buzzed with an electric tension she had never experienced before, conversations stopping abruptly when she passed and resuming in excited whispers once she moved out of earshot. Her week away had transformed her from invisible background figure to the central character in a drama that had consumed the entire school's attention. She had chosen her outfit carefully that morning, selecting dark jeans and a fitted navy blue sweater that wouldn't restrict her movement if another confrontation arose. Her long black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup, wanting nothing that might smudge or become a distraction if she needed to defend herself again. The small silver pendant her grandmother had given her hung at her throat, a reminder of family strength and resilience that she drew comfort from as she navigated the gauntlet of stares and whispers. The first period passed without incident, though Emma could feel the weight of dozens of eyes tracking her every movement. Her English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, seemed nervous and overly solicitous, asking repeatedly if Emma was comfortable with her seat assignment and whether she needed anything. The artificial normalcy felt more unsettling than outright hostility would have been. It was during the transition to second period that Emma encountered her first real test. Chloe Peterson emerged from a cluster of her followers near the main stairwell, her red hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights and her green eyes bright with malicious anticipation. The hallway seemed to part around them as other students sensed the approaching confrontation, creating a natural arena for whatever was about to unfold. Chloe had spent the week carefully orchestrating this moment, planning her approach with the same meticulous attention to detail that Madison had once brought to her campaigns of harassment. She understood that Emma's newfound reputation for martial arts prowess made direct physical confrontation inadvisable, so she had chosen a different battlefield altogether. "Well, well," Chloe announced loudly enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. "Look who decided to show her face again. How was your little vacation, Emma? Did you enjoy getting rewarded for assaulting your classmates?" Emma stopped walking, but didn't turn to face Chloe directly, instead adjusting her backpack straps in a movement that looked casual, but actually positioned her hands for quick defensive action if needed. She had learned from Mrs. Chun that the best way to handle verbal provocation was to remain calm and avoid escalating the situation unless physical force became necessary. "I served my suspension just like Madison served hers," Emma replied evenly, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet hallway. "We're both back in school now, and I'm hoping we can all move forward." Chloe's laugh was sharp and artificial, designed to project confidence while masking the uncertainty she actually felt about confronting someone who had so thoroughly dominated her leader. "Move forward after what you did? I don't think so. Everyone saw how you attacked Madison when she was just trying to help you. That wasn't self-defense, that was assault. Several students in the hallway shifted uncomfortably at this blatant mischaracterization of events they had witnessed firsthand. Jake Martinez stepped forward from the crowd, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic boldness that surprised even him. "That's not what happened, Chloe, and you know it," Jake said firmly. Madison deliberately cut Emma's bra straps with scissors. "I was right there when it happened. So were 20 other people." Chloe's face flushed with anger at being contradicted so publicly. She had counted on the other students' usual reluctance to challenge her version of events, and Jake's unexpected intervention threatened to unravel her carefully planned narrative. "Jake Martinez," she sneered, "since when do you have opinions about anything? You've been invisible for 3 years, and now suddenly you want to play hero? Maybe you should go back to hiding in the library where you belong." The casual cruelty in Chloe's voice was familiar to everyone present, but something had changed in the hallway's dynamic. Instead of the nervous laughter or uncomfortable silence that usually followed such attacks, several other students began voicing their own support for Jake's account. "He's right," said Sarah Kim, a sophomore who had rarely spoken up in any social situation. "I saw the whole thing happen. Madison cut Emma's underwear on purpose." "Madison was laughing about it afterward," added Marcus Torres, a junior who played on the soccer team. "She thought it was hilarious until Emma fought back." Emma watched this unexpected show of support with a mixture of gratitude and concern. She appreciated that other students were finally willing to speak the truth about what had happened, but she also understood that they were painting targets on themselves by challenging Chloe so directly. Chloe seemed to realize that her usual tactics were failing spectacularly. The social dynamics that had allowed her and Madison to dominate through intimidation were shifting in real time, and she was finding herself increasingly isolated as more students found the courage to contradict her narrative. "You're all going to regret this," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "When Madison gets back, she's going to remember every single person who turned against her. And my family has just as much influence in this town as hers does." Emma finally turned to face Chloe directly, her movements smooth and controlled, in a way that made several students take an unconscious step backward. Her brown eyes were calm but intense, carrying an authority that seemed to radiate from her core. "Chloe," Emma said quietly, "Madison isn't coming back today, or tomorrow, or any time this week." The hallway fell completely silent as everyone processed this unexpected information. Chloe's confident facade cracked slightly as she realized that Emma knew something she didn't. "What are you talking about?" Chloe demanded, though uncertainty had crept into her voice. Emma's response was interrupted by the arrival of Principal Johnson, who appeared at the end of the hallway with the harried expression of someone who had been hoping to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. She surveyed the gathered students with obvious frustration before focusing her attention on Emma and Chloe. "Ms. Rodriguez, Miss Peterson," Principal Johnson said sharply, "I need both of you in my office immediately. The rest of you need to get to your classes before you're all marked tardy." The crowd of students dispersed reluctantly, many casting curious glances back at Emma and Chloe as they followed Principal Johnson down the hallway. Emma could hear the excited whispers beginning even before they rounded the corner, and she knew that speculation about Madison's extended absence would spread through the school like wildfire. Principal Johnson's office felt even smaller with Chloe's angry energy filling the space alongside Emma's calm presence. The principal sat behind her desk with a thick folder open in front of her, documents spread across the surface in a way that suggested she had been dealing with crisis management all morning. "Ms. Peterson," Principal Johnson began, "I've received multiple reports that you were attempting to intimidate students in the hallway just now. Given the current sensitive nature of the situation involving you and your friends, I would strongly Advise you to avoid any behavior that could be construed as retaliation or harassment. Chloe's eyes flashed with indignation. I was just trying to set the record straight about what really happened last week. Everyone seems to have forgotten that Madison was the victim in all this. Miss Peterson, Principal Johnson said wearily, I'm going to be very clear with you. The investigation into last week's incident has revealed information that significantly complicates the narrative you and Madison have been promoting. I would suggest that you focus on your own academic responsibilities and avoid further involvement in this matter. Emma felt a chill of apprehension at Principal Johnson's words. The formal tone and careful language suggested that something significant had happened over the weekend. Something that had shifted the administration's perspective on the entire situation. What kind of information? Emma asked quietly. Principal. Johnson hesitated before responding, clearly weighing how much she should reveal to students who were central figures in an ongoing investigation. Additional witnesses have come forward with information about the events leading up to last week's incident. We've also received documentation that suggests this was not an isolated occurrence. Chloe went pale at these words, understanding immediately what they implied. If other students had been willing to come forward with their own experiences of harassment from Madison's group, it would undermine everything they had been trying to accomplish with their damage control efforts. That's impossible, Chloe said, though her voice lacked conviction. Madison never did anything to anyone. People are just making things up because they're jealous of her success. Principal Johnson's expression grew stern. Miss Peterson, I'm going to give you the same advice I'm giving Ms. Rodriguez. Focus on your own conduct going forward. The investigation is ongoing, and additional disciplinary actions may be necessary depending on what we discover. Emma left the principal's office with more questions than answers. But one thing was becoming clear. The incident in the chemistry lab had opened a door that the administration was no longer able to close. As she walked to her next class, she noticed that students were looking at her differently now, not just with curiosity about her martial arts skills, but with something that looked remarkably like respect. The revelation of Madison's extended absence created a power vacuum that sent ripples throughout Riverside High's social ecosystem. Without their leader's commanding presence, Madison's former followers found themselves adrift, uncertain how to maintain their influence or even whether they should try. Some, like Ashley Kim, began quietly distancing themselves from the group entirely, recognizing that association with Madison might soon become more liability than asset. Others, however, doubled down on their loyalty, viewing Madison's absence as a temporary setback that would be reversed once her father's political influence resolved the situation in their favor. These students, led by Chloe, began planning what they saw as a resistance campaign against the false narrative being constructed around their friend. Emma found herself at the center of a social transformation she had never intended to create. Students who had never spoken to her before were approaching her between classes, some to offer support and others simply to satisfy their curiosity about her martial arts background. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent years cultivating invisibility, but she was beginning to understand that there was no returning to her previous anonymity. During lunch period, Emma made her way to the library, seeking the quiet sanctuary it had always provided. She found Jake Martinez already there, sitting at their usual table with several other students she recognized, but had never really talked to before. They looked up as she approached, and she realized that something like a movement was forming around the simple act of telling the truth about what had happened in the chemistry lab. Emma, Jake said, standing as she approached, we've been talking about what happened this morning with Chloe. Some of us think it's time people knew the truth about what's been going on around here. A group at the table included Sarah Kim, the sophomore who had spoken up in the hallway, Marcus Torres from the soccer team, and several other students whose names Emma knew, but whom she had never considered potential allies. They all wore expressions of nervous determination, as if they were preparing to do something they knew was necessary, but dangerous. "What do you mean?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the library's relative privacy. "We've been comparing notes about things Madison and her friends have done over the years. Not just to us, but to other students too. The patterns are really disturbing when you put them all together." Marcus nodded grimly. "I've been thinking about my cousin Miguel. He transferred schools last year because of what they did to him. At the time, we all just accepted that he couldn't handle the social pressure, but now I'm wondering if there was more to it." Emma felt a weight settling on her shoulders as she began to understand the scope of what these students were suggesting. Her confrontation with Madison hadn't been an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of systematic harassment that had been allowed to continue because no one with the power to stop it had been willing to act. "What are you planning to do with this information?" she asked. Jake exchanged glances with the others before responding. "We think it's time to go public. Not just with the school administration, but with the community. People need to know what's been happening here." The idea both thrilled and terrified Emma. Part of her wanted nothing more than to expose the truth about Madison's behavior and the school's failure to address it. But another part of her understood that going public would make her the face of a campaign that could have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. "My sister is a journalism student," Emma said slowly. "She's been investigating what happened last week, and she's found some disturbing patterns too. Maybe we should talk to her about the best way to handle this." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Patterson, the English teacher, who approached their table with obvious concern. Emma tensed, wondering if they were about to be told to disperse or if their discussion had somehow been overheard and reported. "Emma," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately. It's important." Emma followed her teacher to a secluded corner of the library, her mind racing through possibilities about what might have prompted this unusual request. Mrs. Patterson was one of the younger teachers at Riverside High, only in her second year of teaching, and she had always seemed more approachable than many of her colleagues. "Emma," Mrs. Patterson began, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard, "I want you to know that some of us have been aware of the problems with Madison and her friends for a while now. We've tried to address it through proper channels, but the administration has been reluctant to take action against students from influential families." This revelation stunned Emma. She had assumed that the teachers were either unaware of the harassment or simply didn't care enough to intervene. The possibility that they had been trying to help but had been stymied by administrative politics added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. "Why are you telling me this?" Emma asked. Mrs. Patterson hesitated before responding. "Because I think you have a right to know that you're not alone in this, and because I want you to be careful. There are forces at work here that go beyond high school social dynamics. Madison's father is a powerful man, and he's not going to let this situation resolve in a way that reflects poorly on his daughter or his family." The warning sent a chill down Emma's spine. She had been so focused on the immediate aftermath of her confrontation with Madison that she hadn't fully considered the broader political implications of challenging such an influential family. "What should I do?" she asked. "Document everything," Mrs. Patterson advised. "Keep records of any interactions you have with Madison's friends, any attempts at retaliation, anything that might be relevant later. And be very careful about who you trust. Not everyone who claims to support you necessarily has your best interests at heart." Emma returned to her group of newfound allies with Mrs. Patterson's warning echoing in her mind. The conversation had shifted during her absence, becoming more focused on practical questions about how to organize their information and present it in a way that would be taken seriously by adults outside the school system. "We need to be smart about this," Sarah was saying as Emma rejoined them. If we just start making accusations without solid evidence, they'll dismiss us as troublemakers or attention seekers. Marcus had pulled out a notebook and was making lists of incidents they could document, categorizing them by type of harassment and level of evidence available. The organizational approach reminded Emma of Sophia's journalistic methods, and she realized that her sister's involvement might be more crucial than she had initially thought. I think we need professional help, Emma said, causing the others to look up from their planning. This is bigger than just student complaints. We're talking about institutional failure, maybe even civil rights violations. We need someone who understands how to navigate those waters. Jake nodded thoughtfully. My mom works for a nonprofit that deals with educational advocacy. She might know someone who could help us figure out the best approach. The bell signaling the end of lunch period interrupted their discussion, but Emma could see that something significant had been set in motion. As the students gathered their belongings and prepared to return to class, she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about what they were planning to do. The afternoon brought another unexpected development when Emma was called to the main office during her study hall period. She expected to find Principal Johnson waiting for her, but instead she was directed to a conference room where two adults she didn't recognize were seated at the large table. The woman was tall and professional looking, with short gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her an air of academic authority. The man beside her was younger, probably in his 30s, with dark hair and a kind of intense expression that suggested he was accustomed to dealing with serious situations. Ms. Rodriguez, the woman said, standing to shake Emma's hand. I'm Dr. Lisa Warren from the State Education Department, and this is Mr. David Chun from the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's office. We'd like to speak with you about the incident that occurred in your chemistry class last week. Emma felt her heart rate spike as she realized that the situation had escalated far beyond anything she had imagined. The presence of state officials suggested that formal investigations were already underway, investigations that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Are my parents supposed to be here? Emma asked, suddenly feeling very young and uncertain. Dr. Warren smiled reassuringly. We've already spoken with your parents, and they've given permission for us to conduct this preliminary interview. They're aware that we're here, and you can call them at any time if you'd like them to join us. Mr. Chun opened a file folder and removed several documents, including what appeared to be witness statements and incident reports. Emma, we want you to know that you're not in any trouble. We're here because we've received information suggesting that what happened to you may be part of a larger pattern of harassment and discrimination at this school. The interview that followed was unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. The questions were detailed and probing, covering not just the chemistry lab incident, but her entire experience at Riverside High. Dr. Warren and Mr. Chun asked about previous interactions with Madison and her friends, about her observations of how other students were treated, and about the school administration's response to complaints and incidents. Emma found herself describing patterns of behavior she had witnessed but never really analyzed, connections between incidents that she had previously dismissed as unrelated. The officials took careful notes and occasionally asked for clarification or additional details, their professional demeanor making it clear that they took her account very seriously. Emma, Dr. Warren said as the interview was winding down, you should know that you've been very brave in standing up for yourself. What happened to you was completely unacceptable, and the school's initial response was inadequate. We're going to be conducting a thorough investigation, and we may need to speak with you again as that process continues. Mr. Chung leaned forward, his expression serious. I also want you to know that there are legal protections in place for students who report harassment or discrimination. If anyone attempts to retaliate against you for speaking with us or for defending yourself, you should report it immediately. Emma left the conference room feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet once again. The presence of state investigators transformed her personal conflict with Madison into something much larger and more significant. She understood now that her decision to fight back in the chemistry lab had opened a door that couldn't be closed, setting in motion a process that would ultimately examine not just her individual experience but the entire culture of Riverside High School. As she walked through the hallways toward her final class of the day, Emma noticed that something had changed in the way other students looked at her. Word of the state investigators' presence had spread quickly through the school, and students were beginning to understand that the consequences of the chemistry lab incident were expanding far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. Chloe Peterson's campaign to maintain Madison's version of events was crumbling as more students found the courage to contradict her narrative. The arrival of outside investigators had shifted the entire dynamic, making it clear that this was no longer just a matter of high school social politics, but a serious investigation with potential legal ramifications. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia asking her to call as soon as possible. She knew that her sister would want to know about the state investigators and would probably have advice about how to handle the escalating situation. The quiet girl who had wanted nothing more than to remain invisible had become the catalyst for a transformation that would ultimately reshape not just Riverside High School, but the entire Millbrook community's understanding of bullying, institutional responsibility, and the power of individual courage to demand justice. The final bell of the day rang as Emma reached her locker, and she could hear the excited conversations beginning around her as students processed the day's revelations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new revelations, but for the first time since the chemistry lab incident, Emma felt confident that the truth would ultimately prevail. She had learned that standing up for herself meant standing up for everyone who had been victimized by the culture of harassment that had been allowed to flourish at Riverside High, and she was prepared to see that fight through to its conclusion. Madison Brooks returned to Riverside High on a crisp Thursday morning in March, 3 weeks after the state investigation had begun, and 2 weeks after her father's emergency meetings with school board officials had failed to contain the expanding scandal. She stepped out of her mother's silver Mercedes with the same regal bearing she had always possessed, but those who knew her well could see the cracks in her armor. Her designer clothes were perfectly coordinated as always, her makeup flawlessly applied, but there was something brittle in her smile and a tension in her shoulders that suggested the confident queen bee of Riverside High had been fundamentally shaken by recent events. The hallways parted before her as they always had, but the quality of attention she received was markedly different from the admiring deference she had once commanded. Students watched her with a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and in some cases, barely concealed hostility. The whispered conversations that followed in her wake were no longer filled with envy and social gossip but with speculation about criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and the possibility that Riverside High might face federal intervention if the investigation's findings were as damning as rumors suggested. Emma Rodriguez was in her AP history class when she heard the murmur of excitement that always accompanied Madison's presence, but now the sound carried undertones of tension that made her stomach clench with anticipation. She had known this moment would come eventually, but 3 weeks of relative peace had allowed her to hope that perhaps Madison's return might be indefinitely delayed. The state investigators had made it clear that their inquiry was ongoing and that additional disciplinary actions were likely, but Emma understood that political pressure from the Brooks family had ultimately forced the school to readmit Madison. Pending the investigation's conclusion, Mrs. Patterson, who had become something of an unofficial ally to Emma since their conversation in the library, entered the classroom with an expression of barely controlled anxiety. She had attended emergency faculty meetings throughout the week as administrators struggled to develop protocols for managing Madison's return while maintaining the educational environment and ensuring the safety of students who had come forward as witnesses in the investigation. The morning passed with an electric tension humming through the building as students and staff waited to see how Madison would handle her reintegration into a social environment that had been fundamentally altered. During her absence, the informal alliance of harassment victims that had formed around Emma had grown into a more organized support network, with regular meetings facilitated by Mr. Rodriguez from the school counseling staff and informal legal advice provided through Jake Martinez's mother's nonprofit connections. Emma's first direct encounter with Madison came during the lunch period, in the cafeteria where their conflict had originally begun with a spilled chocolate milk that now seemed like a trivial incident from another lifetime. Emma was sitting with her expanded circle of friends when Madison entered the large room with Ashley Kim at her side, Chloe Peterson having been conspicuously absent from school since the previous Friday when rumors had begun circulating about her family's own legal troubles. The cafeteria didn't fall silent as it once would have at Madison's entrance, but conversations definitely shifted as students tracked her movement toward the serving line. Emma forced herself to continue eating her sandwich and participating in the discussion at her table, though she could feel Madison's presence like a physical weight pressing against her consciousness. It was Ashley who made the first move, approaching Emma's table with the kind of calculated boldness that had always characterized her strategic thinking. She stopped just outside the natural boundary of the group's conversation space, close enough to be noticed but not so close as to be obviously intrusive. "Emma," Ashley said, her voice carefully modulated to project reasonableness while carrying clearly to nearby tables. "Madison would like to speak with you privately. She has something important she wants to say." The table fell silent as Emma's friends waited for her response. Jake Martinez shifted slightly in his seat, positioning himself to intervene if necessary, while Sarah Kim's hand moved instinctively toward her phone to begin recording if the situation escalated. The week since the chemistry lab incident had taught them all to be prepared for unexpected confrontations. Emma took a deliberate sip of her water before responding, using the time to center herself the way Mrs. Chun had taught her during their sessions at the dojo. Her martial arts training had evolved significantly since the original incident, with Mrs. Chun helping her understand not just the physical techniques, but the mental discipline required to remain calm under pressure. "If Madison has something to say to me," Emma replied clearly, "she can say it here where everyone can witness the conversation. I'm not interested in private discussions that might be mischaracterized later." Ashley's perfectly practiced smile flickered slightly at this unexpected response. She had anticipated resistance, but had counted on Emma's natural inclination toward avoiding confrontation to make her willing to accept a private meeting where Madison could attempt to control the narrative. "I think you misunderstand, Ashley," sighed, her tone becoming slightly sharper. "Madison wants to apologize for what happened. She realizes that things got out of hand, and she'd like to make things right between you two." Emma felt her friends tense around her at this obvious manipulation. The idea that Madison Brooks would genuinely apologize for anything was so foreign to their shared experience that it immediately raised suspicions about ulterior motives. "Then she can apologize right here," Emma said firmly. "If her remorse is genuine, she shouldn't need privacy to express it." Ashley's mask of diplomatic reasonableness was beginning to slip as she realized that her carefully planned approach was failing spectacularly. She glanced back toward Madison, who was standing near the serving line with an expression of barely controlled fury as she watched her emissary's diplomatic mission collapse. "Fine," Ashley said, her voice dropping its pretense of friendliness. "But don't say we didn't try to handle this civilly." She turned and walked back to Madison, and Emma could see an intense whispered conversation taking place between them. Madison's body language suggested she was arguing for a more aggressive approach, while Ashley appeared to be counseling restraint. The discussion concluded with Madison straightening her shoulders and walking directly toward Emma's table with the kind of determined stride that had once terrorized underclassmen throughout Riverside High. Emma stood as Madison approached, not from respect but from tactical awareness. Mrs. Chun had drilled into her the importance of maintaining mobility and balance in any potentially volatile situation, and she wasn't about to be caught off guard while seated. "Emma Rodriguez," Madison said loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear, "I want to talk to you about what happened in chemistry class." The conversations throughout the large room died away as students realized they were about to witness the confrontation everyone had been anticipating since Madison's return. Phones appeared in hands throughout the cafeteria as students prepared to document whatever was about to unfold. "Go ahead," Emma said simply, her voice calm and steady, despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. Madison seemed momentarily thrown by Emma's composed response. She had expected defensiveness, nervousness, maybe even an attempt to avoid the confrontation entirely. Instead, she found herself facing someone who appeared completely prepared for whatever she might say or do. "What you did to me was completely unacceptable," Madison began, her voice rising with indignation. "You attacked me when I was trying to help you, and you could have seriously injured me with your little martial arts stunt. I want you to know that my family is considering legal action against you and your parents." Emma listened to this speech with something approaching amazement. Even after weeks of investigation, even with state officials examining the evidence, Madison was still attempting to portray herself as the victim of an unprovoked assault. "Madison," Emma said clearly, "you deliberately cut my undergarments with scissors in front of our entire chemistry class. You humiliated me intentionally and maliciously. When you did that, you crossed a line that had serious consequences." "I was trying to fix a problem with your lab coat," Madison insisted, though the lie sounded hollow even to her own ears. "It was an accident, and everyone knows it except the people who are trying to destroy my reputation for their own sick reasons." Jake Martinez stood up from his seat at Emma's table, his movement deliberate and measured. The quiet boy who had once hidden in the background had found his voice during the past few weeks, and he was no longer willing to let Madison's lies go unchallenged. "I was Emma's lab partner that day," he said loudly enough for the entire cafeteria to hear. "I saw exactly what you did, Madison. There was nothing accidental about it. You planned it, you executed it, and you celebrated afterward until Emma made you regret it." Madison's face flushed with anger at being contradicted so publicly by someone she had always considered beneath notice. "Nobody asked for your opinion, Jake. This is between Emma and me." "No," said Sarah Kim, rising from her own seat. "It's not just between you two. It's about all of us who have been targets of your harassment for years." Emma just had the courage to finally fight back. More students began standing throughout the cafeteria, not just at Emma's table, but at tables throughout the room. Marcus Torres rose from his seat near the windows, followed by his soccer teammates. 3 members of the debate team stood in unison, as did several students from the art club and drama department. The movement spread like a wave across the room until nearly half the cafeteria was standing in silent solidarity with Emma. Madison looked around the room with growing panic as she realized that the social dynamics she had once controlled so effortlessly had turned completely against her. The power she had wielded through intimidation and manipulation had evaporated in the face of collective courage, and she found herself isolated in a room full of people who no longer feared her. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice beginning to crack with desperation. "You're all being manipulated by someone who attacked me for no reason. When my father hears about this, there are going to be serious consequences for everyone involved." Emma took a step forward, closing the distance between herself and Madison to just a few feet. Her movement was smooth and controlled, but there was something in her posture that made Madison instinctively step backward. "Your father already knows about this, Madison," Emma said quietly. The state investigators have been very thorough in their examination of what happened here. They've interviewed dozens of students, reviewed security footage, and documented a pattern of harassment that goes back years. The only person facing serious consequences here is you." Madison's eyes widened as she realized that Emma possessed information she hadn't expected. The state investigation had been conducted with enough discretion that most students were only aware of its existence in general terms. But Emma's access to specific details suggested that she was far more central to the official inquiry than Madison had realized. "You don't know what you're talking about," Madison said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I know that 17 different students have provided statements about harassment they experienced from you and your friends," Emma continued relentlessly. "I know that the investigators found evidence of systematic targeting of students based on their economic status, ethnicity, and social standing. I know that the Federal Civil Rights Division is now involved because the pattern suggests discrimination based on protected characteristics." The color drained from Madison's face as Emma recited facts that were supposed to be confidential. She had been told by her father's lawyers that the investigation was a routine inquiry that would ultimately exonerate her. But Emma's detailed knowledge suggested that the situation was far more serious than she had been led to believe. "I also know," Emma said, stepping closer still, "that Principal Johnson and 2 other administrators have been placed on administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation. And I know that the school board is facing a federal compliance review that could result in the loss of state funding if they don't implement immediate reforms." Madison stumbled backward, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. "That's impossible. My father said this would all be resolved quietly. He promised that nothing serious would happen." Emma felt a moment of sympathy for Madison, despite everything that had transpired between them. The girl standing before her was no longer the confident predator who had ruled Riverside High through fear and manipulation, but a confused teenager who was beginning to understand that her actions had consequences that even her family's influence couldn't eliminate. "Madison," Emma said more gently, "your father lied to you. This stopped being something that could be resolved quietly the moment you decided to assault me in front of witnesses. And it became something much bigger when the investigation revealed that what happened to me was part of a systematic pattern of harassment that violated federal civil rights laws." The cafeteria had fallen completely silent as students strained to hear every word of this extraordinary conversation. Many were recording on their phones, understanding that they were witnessing a historic moment in their school's history. Ashley Kim appeared at Madison's shoulder, her face pale with anxiety as she realized how badly their confrontation was going. "Madison, we should leave. We should call your father and figure out what to do next." But Madison seemed frozen in place, staring at Emma as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said quietly. "It was supposed to be just a prank. I was angry about the cafeteria thing, and I wanted to embarrass you a little. I never thought. You never thought about how your actions would affect other people," Emma finished for her. "You never considered that humiliating someone in front of their classmates might cause real harm. You never understood that using your social position to target people who couldn't fight back was a form of bullying that would eventually have consequences." Madison's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion she had displayed since returning to school. "What's going to happen to me?" Emma looked around the silent cafeteria, seeing faces filled with curiosity, anger, sympathy, and hope. These were her classmates, people she would continue to interact with for the remainder of the school year and beyond. The decision she made about how to respond to Madison's question would define not just their relationship, but the entire social culture of Riverside High going forward. "That depends on you," Emma said finally. "The legal consequences are out of my hands now. The investigators and the courts will determine what penalties you face for what you did. But what happens here, in this school, with these people, that's something you still have some control over. Madison wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. What do you mean? I mean you can choose to learn from this experience, Emma explained. You can acknowledge the harm you've caused and commit to being better. You can use whatever influence you have left to help create a school environment where harassment and bullying aren't tolerated. Or you can continue to fight the consequences and make everything worse for yourself and everyone else. The silence stretched for nearly a minute as Madison processed Emma's words. Around them, students waited to see how she would respond to this unexpected offer of a path toward redemption. I don't know how, Madison said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma felt Mrs. Chun's teachings echoing in her mind. Lessons about strength and compassion, about the responsibility that came with the power to defend oneself and others. She had learned that true martial arts mastery involved not just the ability to defeat opponents, but the wisdom to know when victory could be achieved through other means. You start by telling the truth, Emma said. You admit what you did, not just to me but to everyone you've hurt over the years. You cooperate with the investigation instead of fighting it. And you use whatever time you have left at this school to try to repair some of the damage you've caused. Madison looked around the cafeteria, meeting the eyes of students she had tormented, humiliated, and dismissed over the years. The weight of their collective judgment was overwhelming, but Emma could see something shifting in her expression. A recognition that denial and defiance were no longer sustainable strategies. I'm sorry, Madison said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. I'm sorry to Emma for what I did in chemistry class. I'm sorry to everyone I've hurt or made feel unwelcome here. I was wrong, and I'm ready to face the consequences of my actions. The cafeteria remained silent for a long moment before scattered applause began, growing into a sustained ovation that acknowledged not just Madison's apology but the courage it had taken for all of them to stand up to the culture of harassment that had dominated their school for so long. Emma extended her hand to Madison, who stared at it for several seconds before reaching out to accept the gesture. The handshake was brief and formal, but it represented something significant, the possibility that even the deepest conflicts could be resolved through truth, accountability, and the choice to be better than the worst moments of one's past. The state investigation concluded 6 weeks later with findings that were even more damning than Emma had initially suggested. The final report documented a systematic pattern of harassment and discrimination that had been allowed to flourish due to administrative negligence and the preferential treatment of students from influential families. Principal Johnson and 2 other administrators were terminated, while the school district faced federal oversight and mandatory compliance training. Madison Brooks accepted a plea agreement that included community service, restitution payments to several of her victims, and mandatory counseling. She finished her senior year at Riverside High but declined to participate in graduation ceremonies, choosing instead to begin her community service work at a nonprofit organization that provided support services to victims of bullying and harassment. Chloe Peterson's family moved away from Millbrook after her father's lumber company faced boycotts and protests related to his daughter's involvement in the harassment campaign. Ashley Kim completed her senior year quietly, having fully distanced herself from her former friends and focusing on academic pursuits that would allow her to leave for college as quickly as possible. Emma Rodriguez became something of a local celebrity, invited to speak at schools throughout the state about standing up to bullying and the importance of institutional accountability. She received a full scholarship to study psychology at Portland State University, with plans to eventually work in educational settings helping other students navigate hostile social environments. The transformation at Riverside High was profound and lasting. New policies were implemented requiring immediate investigation of harassment complaints, and staff received extensive training on recognizing and addressing discriminatory behavior. A peer mediation program was established to help students resolve conflicts before they escalated to serious incidents. Mrs. Chin presented Emma with her black belt in judo during a ceremony attended by her family, friends, and several state officials who had been involved in the investigation. In her speech accepting the honor, Emma emphasized that true martial arts mastery involved not just physical technique, but the wisdom to know when and how to use one's power responsibly. Jake Martinez was elected student body president the following year, running on a platform of inclusivity and zero tolerance for harassment. He frequently credited Emma's courage in standing up to Madison as the inspiration for his own decision to become more actively involved in school leadership. Sofia Rodriguez completed her journalism degree and began working for a major newspaper, specializing in investigative reporting on educational issues. Her documentation of the Riverside High case became a model for other journalists covering similar stories of institutional failure and student activism. The Brooks family never recovered from the scandal. Councilman Brooks lost his bid for re-election in a landslide, and the family eventually left Millbrook to start over in another state. Madison's college plans were disrupted by her legal troubles, but she eventually enrolled in a community college program focused on social work, apparently genuine in her desire to help others who had experienced the kind of harm she had once inflicted. Emma's story became a case study in several academic programs focused on educational policy and civil rights enforcement. The transformation at Riverside High was cited as an example of how individual courage could catalyze systemic change when combined with proper institutional accountability and community support. 5 years later, Emma returned to Riverside High as a guest speaker during National Bullying Prevention Week. The school had been transformed beyond recognition, with hallways decorated with student artwork celebrating diversity and inclusion, peer mediation rooms where conflicts could be resolved peacefully, and a memorial garden dedicated to students who had been lost to bullying-related suicide at other schools. Standing at the podium in the auditorium where she had once sat silent and invisible, Emma looked out at an audience of students who reminded her of her younger self, some confident, some struggling, all deserving of an educational environment where they could learn and grow without fear of harassment or discrimination. "The most important thing I learned from my experience here," she told them, "is that we all have more power than we realize. Power to stand up for ourselves, power to protect others, and power to demand that the institutions around us live up to their responsibilities. But with that power comes the obligation to use it wisely and compassionately." She paused, remembering the moment in the chemistry lab when everything had changed, when a quiet girl's decision to fight back had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately transformed an entire community. "You don't have to be loud to be strong," she continued. "You don't have to be popular to be powerful. You just have to be willing to stand up when it matters, to tell the truth when it's difficult, and to believe that you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect." The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, coming from students who understood that they were hearing from someone who had walked their path and emerged stronger on the other side. As Emma left the auditorium and walked through the transformed hallways of Riverside High, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single moment of courage, when someone decides that they will no longer be a victim and chooses instead to fight for justice. The quiet girl who had once perfected the art of invisibility had become a voice for the voiceless, proving that true strength comes not from the ability to dominate others, but from the courage to stand up when standing up matters most. Her legacy at Riverside High would endure long after her graduation, a reminder that even the smallest person can make the biggest difference when they refuse to let cruelty triumph over courage. 10 years after the chemistry lab incident that changed everything, Emma Rodriguez stood in the hallway of Jefferson Middle School in downtown Portland, watching a group of 8th graders navigate the complex social dynamics that had once seemed so overwhelming in her own life. As the newly appointed Director of Student Advocacy for the Portland Public School District, she had spent the morning observing classroom interactions and meeting with teachers about implementing the anti-bullying protocols that had become her specialty. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now spent her days in schools, the very environments that had once felt like battlegrounds. But these weren't the same sterile, hierarchical institutions she remembered from her youth. The schools where Emma worked now were vibrant communities where student voice mattered, where conflicts were addressed through restorative justice practices, and where every child understood that they had both rights and responsibilities in creating a positive learning environment. Her office walls were decorated with letters from students across the Pacific Northwest, thanking her for the programs she had developed and the training sessions she had conducted. Some were from kids who had found the courage to report harassment after hearing her speak. Others were from former bullies who had learned to channel their leadership abilities in more positive directions. Each letter represented a life changed, a conflict resolved, a school culture transformed. The journey to this point had been longer and more complex than anyone could have predicted that February day when Madison Brooks had cut her bra straps. In front of their chemistry class, Emma's college years at Portland State had been marked by intensive study in educational psychology, countless hours of research into the roots of aggressive behavior, and practical experience working with youth organizations throughout the region. Her master's thesis had examined the long-term effects of peer mediation programs on school climate, using Riverside High as a primary case study. The data she collected showed remarkable improvements, not just in reported incidents of harassment, but in overall academic performance, student engagement, and teacher retention. The transformation that had begun with her single act of self-defense had created ripple effects that were still being measured and studied by education researchers around the world. Emma's doctoral dissertation had expanded that research nationally, examining how individual acts of courage could catalyze institutional change when combined with proper support systems and administrative accountability. She had interviewed hundreds of students, teachers, and administrators from schools that had undergone similar transformations, documenting the factors that determined whether reform efforts succeeded or failed. The patterns she identified had become the foundation for the advocacy programs she now directed, comprehensive approaches that address not just the immediate symptoms of bullying behavior, but the underlying cultural and systemic factors that allowed harassment to flourish. Her work emphasized prevention over punishment, community building over individual discipline, and restorative justice over zero-tolerance policies that often created more problems than they solved. Mrs. Chun, now in her 80s but still teaching judo 3 days a week, had become something of a celebrity in martial arts circles as the instructor who had trained the girl, whose self-defense had sparked a national conversation about bullying and institutional accountability. She frequently spoke at tournaments and training seminars about the philosophical foundations of martial arts and the responsibility that came with the ability to defend oneself and others. The dojo where Emma had learned those crucial skills had expanded into a community center offering programs for at-risk youth, conflict resolution training for educators, and self-defense classes specifically designed for students who had been targets of harassment. Mrs. Chun had insisted that Emma join the board of directors, recognizing that her students' expertise in educational policy was essential for the center's continued growth and effectiveness. Sofia Rodriguez had built a distinguished career in investigative journalism, with her coverage of the Riverside High case serving as a launching pad for broader reporting on educational equity and civil rights enforcement. She had won several prestigious awards for her work exposing systemic discrimination in schools across the country, always crediting her sister's courage as the inspiration for her own commitment to holding institutions accountable for protecting vulnerable students. The documentary Sofia had produced about the Riverside case 5 years after the original incident had aired on national television and sparked congressional hearings about federal oversight of local school districts. The film had followed Emma, Madison, and several other key figures as they reflected on the long-term consequences of that pivotal moment, offering a nuanced perspective on justice, redemption, and the possibility of personal transformation. Madison Brooks had indeed pursued her community college social work program with unexpected dedication and sincerity. After completing her associate degree, she had transferred to a 4-year university where she earned a bachelor's degree in counseling psychology with a specialty in adolescent development. Her senior capstone project had been a peer counseling program for students who had engaged in bullying behavior based on her own experience of accountability and change. The program Madison developed had been implemented in several school districts throughout the Pacific Northwest, offering an alternative to traditional disciplinary approaches that often resulted in increased alienation and resentment. Her work focused on helping students understand the impact of their actions on others, while providing them with tools for building healthier relationships and more positive ways of exercising social influence. Emma and Madison had maintained an unusual professional relationship over the years, occasionally collaborating on research projects and training programs. Their interactions were formal and carefully bounded, but there was a mutual respect that had grown from their shared understanding of how quickly life could change and how important it was to use second chances wisely. During one particularly memorable conference presentation, they had appeared together on a panel about restorative justice in educational settings. Madison had spoken honestly about her journey from perpetrator to advocate, while Emma had discussed the importance of creating systems that held people accountable while still offering paths toward redemption. The audience had been moved by their willingness to share such a personal story in service of helping others navigate similar challenges. Jake Martinez had followed through on his early promise as a student leader, earning degrees in public administration and educational policy, before running successfully for the Millbrook School Board at the unusually young age of 26. His campaign had focused on maintaining the reforms that had transformed Riverside High while expanding those innovations to the district's elementary and middle schools. As a school board member, Jake had pushed for increased mental health resources, expanded arts programs, and comprehensive anti-bullying policies that address not just individual incidents but the underlying conditions that allowed harassment to flourish. His first-hand experience as both a witness to the chemistry lab incident and a participant in the student movement that followed had given him credibility with both young people and adults in the community. The transformation of Millbrook itself had been perhaps the most surprising outcome of the events at Riverside High. The scandal surrounding the Brooks family and the federal investigation into the school district had forced the entire community to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege, accountability, and the responsibilities that came with local leadership. New businesses had moved into the town, attracted by the reputation for progressive educational policies and community engagement that had emerged from the crisis. The downtown area had been revitalized with youth-friendly spaces, including Community Art Center, where Emma's old sketches were displayed as part of an exhibit about students who had made a difference in their schools. The annual Millbrook Youth Leadership Conference, established in honor of the students who had stood up during the cafeteria confrontation, now attracted participants from across the region. Emma was a regular keynote speaker at the event, but she insisted that the real stars were the current students who continued to find new ways to address challenges in their schools and communities. Dr. Lisa Warren, the state education official who had led the original investigation, had been promoted to director of the Federal Office for Civil Rights, where she oversaw compliance efforts in school districts nationwide. She frequently cited the Riverside High case as an example of how federal intervention could support rather than supplant local reform efforts when communities were willing to embrace change. The legal precedents established during the civil rights investigation had been applied in dozens of similar cases across the country, creating a framework for addressing institutional discrimination in educational settings. Law schools now used. The case is a teaching tool for students studying civil rights enforcement and educational equity. Emma's parents had never fully recovered from their amazement at seeing their quiet daughter become a nationally recognized advocate and expert. Carlos Rodriguez still ran the family restaurant, but he had become something of a local celebrity himself, with customers frequently asking him to tell stories about Emma's childhood and whether he had always known she would become someone special. Maria Rodriguez had returned to school herself, earning a degree in social work at the age of 52 and opening a family counseling practice that specialized in helping parents and children navigate the challenges of adolescence. She credited Emma's experience with teaching her the importance of helping young people find their voices and develop the skills to advocate for themselves. The legacy of that February morning in the chemistry lab had extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Emma's story had become part of the curriculum in teacher preparation programs, where future educators learned about recognizing the warning signs of systematic harassment and understanding their responsibilities for creating safe learning environments. Martial arts organizations had developed new training protocols that emphasized the ethical dimensions of self-defense, using Emma's example to teach students about when and how to use their skills responsibly. Mrs. Chun's philosophy of martial arts as a tool for justice rather than dominance had become influential in dojos and training centers around the world. The research Emma had conducted during her graduate studies had contributed to new federal guidelines for investigating harassment complaints in educational settings. Her work had demonstrated the importance of looking beyond individual incidents to identify patterns of discrimination and institutional failure, leading to more comprehensive and effective enforcement efforts. Corporate training programs had adopted techniques Emma developed for addressing workplace harassment, recognizing that the same dynamics that operated in school hallways could be found in office buildings and professional environments. Her expertise in restorative justice approaches had proven particularly valuable in helping organizations rebuild trust and productivity after discrimination incidents. As Emma walked through Jefferson Middle School that autumn morning, she reflected on how different her life might have been if she had chosen to remain silent and invisible after Madison's attack. The quiet girl who had once believed that avoiding conflict was the safest path had learned that sometimes the most dangerous choice was refusing to stand up when standing up mattered. The students she observed now lived in a world where their voices were heard and valued, where conflicts were addressed through dialogue rather than domination, and where everyone understood that creating a positive school climate was a shared responsibility. They took for granted freedoms and protections that had been hard-won through the courage of students, like those who had stood up in the Riverside High cafeteria a decade earlier. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message from a teacher in rural Oregon, asking for advice about implementing a peer mediation program in her small district. It was the kind of request she received several times each week, reminders that the work of creating safe and inclusive schools was ongoing, and that her experience continued to have relevance for new generations of students and educators. She typed back a quick response offering to schedule a consultation call, then paused to watch a group of sixth graders working together to resolve a disagreement about playground rules. Their natural use of conflict resolution skills, their assumption that problems could be solved through communication rather than force, represented the kind of cultural change that had been the ultimate goal of all the reforms that followed the chemistry lab incident. The bell signaling the end of the school day rang throughout Jefferson Middle School, and Emma gathered her materials to head to her next appointment. She had 3 more schools to visit that week, each presenting its own unique challenges and opportunities for creating positive change. As she walked toward the exit, Emma passed a display case containing student artwork celebrating diversity and inclusion. One piece, created by a 7th grader named Maria Santos, showed a group of students of different backgrounds standing together with the caption, "When we stand together, nobody stands alone." It reminded Emma of that moment in the cafeteria, when her classmates had risen from their seats in solidarity, transforming her individual act of courage into a collective movement for justice. The quiet girl who had once perfected the art of invisibility had learned that true strength came not from hiding but from standing up, not from avoiding conflict but from addressing it constructively, and not from seeking personal victory, but from working toward collective justice. Her legacy would continue to ripple outward through every student who learned to use their voice, every teacher who created a safer classroom, and every school that chose transformation over tolerance of injustice. Emma Rodriguez had discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon against cruelty was simply the refusal to accept it, and that one person's courage to fight back could change not just their own life, but the lives of countless others who found inspiration in their example. The chemistry lab at Riverside High had been the beginning of her story, not the end, and the lessons learned in that moment of crisis continued to shape a better world for students everywhere. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.